Hi, everybody. Welcome to Analytics Everywhere, Presets podcast about all sorts of data topics, analytics in general. And as usual, Max is here from Preset, our illustrious CEO and founder of Apache Superset and Apache Airflow. And we have our guest today from Dosu, dosu.dev, Devin Stein. Devin, would you like to introduce yourself beyond that at all?
Of course. Yes. First, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here. Been longtime user and fan of both Apache Superset and Airflow. So I'm founder and CEO of Dosu. Dosu saves developers times by acting as a first line of defense for incoming issues and questions. And how I got into Dosu and before Dosu, I found that as I grew in seniority as an engineer in my career, I found out that I was spending most of my time, basically sharing engineering context, whether I was helping people know what has changed recently, or answering questions based off my knowledge of the code base, or helping people triage issues. And when I looked at kind of the LLM landscape, there's a lot of people focused on LLM's ability to generate code. But as a developer, I really like to code. And I was like, well, can we use the same technology and this new, the fact that we now have things that can reason over code to do the parts of my job that were very time consuming and not as fun as writing code. And so those are the sorts of things that we're really excited about at Dosu.
Right. And when we first started talking, the subject of just kind of maintaining open source repositories and all the pain that comes with it was really the subject. The overwhelming number of issues, the overwhelming number of PRs, and discussions on GitHub and all of that stuff. So you've helped out the Superset project quite a bit with that. So thanks, first and foremost. But we'd like to get into the mechanics, a little bit of how that all works. So I don't know how much you're willing to talk about the underlying technologies, but we're curious how you kind of train or fine tune or do RAG work for your customers and clients.
Yeah, quick, just saying a few things. So we built some features too at Preset on top of Superset, around AI assist type thing. So we've built a thing that's like a SQL. It's kind of a bot that you can use natural language to generate SQL. And then we built a bit of a RAG application. So that means in our context, the bot knows, or we vectorize all your data sets and your context, so all the information about your schema and your metadata, some of your data, sample data. So we're able to retrieve that, so that the LLM is able to generate some good SQL. But we've played a little bit with custom training, fine tuning, ragging. The context window was really small when we started. Now it's much bigger. So I think people are making decisions around architecture now. It's evolving pretty quickly, and everyone's interested in how do you build these applications? Mm-hmm. What are the best practices? So here's some of the choices you've made, some choices you might have changed or you might reconsider in the future too.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack there. I think it's a really interesting topic and something that's, I guess, constantly evolving. What is the best way to do use LLMs to solve these types of problems? So I guess taking a step back, like you were saying, Evan, how Dosu got started was both as an engineer, kind of at companies. I spent a lot of time answering questions, triaging issues, but I also got involved in open source about 5 years ago. And as a maintainer, you spend the majority of your time not writing code, but actually helping the community. And the way you typically help the community is around people are trying to get started and they're not as able to navigate a code base effectively. Maybe they aren't familiar with the language of the library or framework is in, or maybe they just don't know that this is a known issue and it's buried somewhere in GitHub issues and it's really hard to find, or maybe something changed in a recent version. And so
I'd like to add one thing there. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, Please. It's the more you do it, the more you welcome it too. So I found that the more you process issues and the more you review PRs, the more issues will come, the more PR will come, the more you comment, the more comments there will be. So it's unscalable at some point. The more you do it, the more comes. So you need help. That's
exactly. It is I don't know, maybe it's kind of the curse of open source in some ways, is like your success ends up being more and more work, and it just usually only grows. More popular frameworks get more adoption, and so on. So and yeah, so in order to do this, we need to like have Dosu understand some of the same things that a maintainer has, and I use maybe understand it quotes, more able to like find it. I think that's where we always try like use LLMs at what we think they're really good at. And LLMs are really good at finding information, probably in some ways better than a human, because the memory's boundless. They don't get tired, assuming you can search information effectively. So at a very high level, the way Dosu works is we ingest all of your code, your commit history and PRs. So like what kind of the state of the world looks like today, what has changed over time, as well as previously asked questions or issues and discussions. And we're also bringing in like slowly adding more data sources similar to that, like that maintainers have access to, like documentation or Slack channels, where there might be other related information that would be useful for Dosu. So we ingest all that and then index it such that we kind of know the types of questions that people are going to be asking in open source projects. They're going to be running into issues where they're trying to do something where the expected behavior doesn't match the kind of the behavior they're seeing, or they're just trying to figure out how to get started, or they have a question about some edge case. So we do a lot of work up front on like trying to massage data into a format where we think it'll be good at answering those types of questions. And the I guess two other pieces is GitHub issues in particular. And I think it's true for just open source or engineering questions, are quite complex. They're not usually like one line. How do I do this? It often
the answers
is
are
like,
also very complex, very often,
right,
too, where you point to some code, you had some context, some history. This person worked on that at that time. Maybe you go
exactly.
get blame and figure out who worked, that kind of stuff.
Yep. Yeah. And so what that kind of, the way we sort of tried to translate that to in Dosu agent LLM world is, how do we break down any input of, some level of complexity into a sequence of tasks or questions that Dosu can then go try solve. And then once it thinks it's found enough information, or then can it return a response. And we're continuously like iterating on that loop and what that loop looks like. But that is kind of the core of how most agents like Dosu work today.
Can you talk about the specifics? Say, like, do you use vector databases? If so, which one you selected and why? Yeah, it might be getting into like more details than you're willing to share. There might be some IP on here, but curious on that in terms of the prep too, and like how to kind of structure all that information. Like thinking about code, right? You have to cut these large modules and something that fits in embeddings too. That gets kind of hard because there's maybe this function is, you want to bring what's calling the function or what it calls like close by, so it's there, so you don't have to do multiple lookups. So I'm not sure, curious how much you can share there.
Yeah, on the technology side, which vector database we're using, it's kind of in flux right now. We started off on pgvector and Postgres.
We did too. It's really convenient. If you don't have a large space to search, it does the job well, right? It's just when you start searching very large corpus, which for you it's not that large because you're always kind of partitioned by project, I would assume. So that search space is pretty limited, right?
Yes, the like kind of natural partitioning helps a lot. But we've also been exploring kind of migrating to LanceDB. And I think the nice thing and I guess relevant thing especially for this podcast, I really like Lance because I come from like a data engineering background. And Lance stores is essentially a file format Parquet-like for vectors in S3. And so you kind of can return to more traditional ML feature engineering type of ways of thinking about your vector database. It makes it easy to like read in your bunch of vectors, maybe transform them, rewrite them out somewhere else. It makes like versioning or like partitioning, like saving kind of what did my vector store look like last week, really simple as well. So there's a lot of properties that get me excited about Lance. It's also open source.
Is it like a little bit like DuckDB? I don't know if you're familiar with DuckDB or SQLite, where you can instantiate the database just for the duration of the query and then flush it, right? So that it would be almost like your thread is gonna fire up a thing, look up an S3, run a query, and then kind of disappear as if it never existed, almost like Lambda-like. So is that what Lambda?
Exactly. It's just like you just read files. So those files can be in S3, they can be locally on disk. You don't need like a server to be, you could just, run it on your machine. You could have some kind of API in front of it for performance optimization, but it's really as simple as like reading files.
Super cool. And then have you looked into fine tuning or custom training? So either having your own kind of custom train model, all that stuff is like super prohibitive. When we looked at it, a preset for building our stuff, like RAG was really the way to go. But maybe it's becoming easier to fine tune. But like the fine tuning stuff was not that interesting. The APIs looked good, but then it was very kind of chatbot oriented, and it's like it was unclear. You could not really ingest a lot of data in there, just like question answers. So it didn't seem like a good fit at the time for us.
Yeah, it's something that I think fine tuning has its purpose for certain things, especially as like a performance optimization and cost optimization. So when we think about like improving performance, we kind of think about two different types of tasks. Some that we do that are like exactly the same across all of our customers. And so something like that might be classifying a input as like a bug, feature, or question. There's like one task, and that's the same across everyone. And like that, we could see fine tuning or even just using a classical machine learning model makes a ton of sense, because it'll be like we have a ton of training data. It's it's one model across everyone.
Across all customers, so not fine tuning per custom or per project in your case, right? That's where it gets dicey when you start doing fine tuning or training per project. That gets very prohibitive.
Exactly, and so the way we're trying to approach like fine tuning, quote unquote, or learning per customer is really relying on in context learning is our bet. In that models have gotten, like, the context window has gotten much larger, and they're going to presumably continue to increase. And now you have a lot of context length to play around with for examples of like what does good mean, or like what is correct mean specifically for this project. So in the kind of preset superset example, that could be like, how do we find example responses from you and Evan for like, this is what like a good maintainer response looks like, or on this topic, here's some information that we can trust. And so using that kind of larger context length, plus trying to find reputable examples to put into that, is how we think about like customization on a
all in the RAG kind of
project.
way, right? Like a few shots kind of approach or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like transforming the weights in whatever way. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It feels like a lot of people are doing that now, are taking the same approach now, like minimizing the definitely training per customer use case is like, we're not quite there yet. It's going to take a moment before you can get.
And I think examples, like the few shot, many shot examples, is a really nice abstraction, because then you kind of flip the problem of fine tuning on its head a bit, and like your objective becomes, how do we make it easy to, how do we find good examples from like user interactions, either with Dosu or outside of Dosu, and then also how do we make our product UX such that we can get more examples as well.
Speaking of examples and correctness, I think one of the things that Dosu has done really well for us that has led to successful closing of a lot of issues and stuff is that it's able to reference other issues and other PRs and various bits of code very accurately, which is fantastic. How do you kind of solve this hallucination problem that LLMs tend to have, where it might just generate some BS issues and all of that? How do you suppress that?
I mean, we had a conversation about it this morning. We're constantly iterating and improving. I think there are examples. So something that we have to our advantage, especially in the GitHub issues domain, is that we have time, which goes a really long way for reducing hallucinations. Where you think status quo GitHub issues, on most projects, you're not getting a response for hours or days, maybe weeks, months. I'm on tickets that are years old. And so because of that, if Dosu responds in 8 or 10 minutes, like that's fast by GitHub issues standards. And because of that, that gives us time to really refine the context that goes into the final prompt. And it overall like helps reduce hallucinations pretty significantly. The challenge with that is that like we also want to make Dosu available on other mediums like Slack, where people want much snappier responses. So then, we have to also be able to kind of maintain that same level of quality, but in a kind of faster format. And the other piece of it is like code has some properties that make it easier in terms of hallucinations. And I think we still have a lot of work to do here, but things like one really common place LLMs hallucinate is like import paths. Like that is like statically, you can verify like, is this import path correct or not?
Or just like this function should exist. Like I'm just gonna create an example that from package, import, really useful function you wish existed because it should exist. So it will just kind of make up APIs and things like that. But yeah, I think like something that's really interesting and maybe a problem with LLMs today, or with just the way we use them, is like ChatGPT is just eager to respond very quickly and respond something from memory, where like any human would be like, let me Google this a little bit. I'm going to go look at this PR, this issue. I'm going to take the time to come up with a good answer. But like GPT is always like, I'm going to start, sending words at you. I'm not going to create a little plan as to how to best answer your question. I guess that's stuff that you can build. A thought around this too, that I thought, something that I thought about for GPT or for these use cases is the caller, the person asking, could say, hey, give me the best answer possible in whatever amount of time you can get to me in 10 minutes, or give me, I need an answer right now. Doesn't matter if it's less accurate. I think it's a good idea to let the user say like, hey, ChatGPT, I need a new diet plan or a new gym training plan, but I don't need it until tomorrow. Like, take your time. Do your research, ask me questions too. That's one thing, like the LM will never be like, hey, can you clarify this? This is really ambiguous. So that's something to work on. And it's great to know that you have the time. Like it's pretty easy to beat a human here in terms of how long the expectation on time. So I would urge you to like take the time to get more accurate answer, as opposed to just spewing, things out from memory. That's what we've seen so far, right? Like the bot is not always instantaneous, but it's accurate, and it provides a lot of context, which is great.
I think giving the users controls is something that we're trying to lean into more of. Like, we've thought about that exact type of slider on an organization level as like, okay, how much, like, I care a ton about quality, but I only want those to respond to like a few issues at most, but they want them to be really high quality versus, on the other extreme, like just help surface relevant resources to my users like as fast as possible. And I think it's interesting to think about that on a per user basis as well. It's like, what do I need right now from Dosu?
Speaking of things you'll be getting into, going forward, I guess we've talked a lot about the roadmap. We have several questions we could ask you about that. I'm not sure how much you want to share yet again, but what do you see being automated as you go forward for repo maintainers in general?
Yeah, one thing that I'm very excited about right now is, part of our, I guess, product philosophy with Dosu is we launched really early, and Dosu's been very public early on, so we could just understand like what types of questions and issues and requests do people have around open source projects or code generally. And I feel like we're getting to a point where we kind of understand like what types of resources that like Dosu needs to be successful, but also like the types of questions that people want from a project. And what that kind of ends up looking like is sort of an engineering knowledge base, but for a project where you have like, okay, how do I get started with this project? What are common questions and answers what are known issues, and do they have a workaround? If so, what is it? What has changed recently in this project? If I quickly want to see if I've been impacted, and what are like kind of the labeling guides or PR guidelines for this project? So looking forward, I think we're really excited about, we're doing a lot of information structuring on Dosu's end to help it respond, but we're also excited about like how do we expose this back to users and not just through Dosu, but like as its own website or app, where for a project like Superset, you can kind of see this knowledge base like pretty explicitly.
And do you think that'll manifest itself in Dosu actually contributing things like documentation or maybe little patches like Dependabot++ or even tiny bug fixes or something like that in the future?
Yeah, I think so. Documentation, I think definitely is pretty likely. Especially like we want to make it easier to keep documentation in sync. I think that's something that LLMs are really well positioned to do. So we want to help on the documentation side for sure. And then on the fixes side, yes, we'd also like to help out there. On the open source side, I think I guess our angle on it is like we'd want to enable a contributor to make that PR, even if Dosu knows how to solve it. I'd rather like give someone a button to say, hey, like click this and I get to generate a PR, so that they feel a bit more connected to the project. But like trying to figure out which of those bug fixes and stuff Dosu is confident and can solve is something we're pretty interested in.
I sense something in your approach that's a bit unique, which is great. I think we have to think about how humans are going to collaborate with AI, not make them feel like they're taking over and that the AI is like taking over their job or they're hostile or they're better than them. Like you want to really see it as someone who's there to help. I like the idea of saying like this AI is not submitting PRs, but it might tell you what would be a really good PR to open and provide you with all the pointers to, which file to change and what to consider. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really kind of important thing. I think in terms of like the workload on the issue specifically, there it seems like triaging is a big part of things too. So I think the LLM could have a pretty good impression of who has been working on what throughout the history of the project and what's hot, what's old, like who's the best person to ask. So sometimes it could be like, let me try to give you the best answer I can. But if I can't find a good answer, let me find someone who's going to have the
in fact, it actually does that. It does help triaging a bit with the auto labeling, which I'd recommend to anybody listening. That's been a huge help. But also, I have seen instances where Dosu just, I don't know if there's a confidence threshold involved or what, but it says, I don't know the answer to this, but hey, at Razakis, maybe you know. So it has mentioned to me and others. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, we try to figure out like when Dosu needs help from a human. And we are trying to lean into more of like, can we figure out from Git history, conversation histories, like who is the appropriate person? So we're not always just being Evan.
I think improving the docs, like in a lot of cases, when you answer a question, like really often in the past, so instead of answering the question, I would open a PR with the contributing to the doc the answer to that question, even if it's an FAQ entry or clarifying an unclear part of the documentation. So maybe that could be the other way around, where Dosu is like, here's the answer, and someone should really go and update that section of the doc that's not super clear about this question.
100%. There was actually like an early kind of Dosu power user. I think in the Llama Index repository, I'm trying to remember exactly which one, and they were using Dosu to get answers about questions about the code, and then they made PRs to update the docs with those answers. That was quite clever.
Awesome.
Very cool. I guess there's a lot of ways you could go with it. You could even do, instead of opening PRs or something like that, when reviewing PRs, do those little code suggestions that GitHub allows you to do, like, hey, this line is causing your linting issue. Maybe fix that.
They can push commit. They could push a small commit on that branch to clarify a paragraph in the docs or something like that.
Yeah. Sweet. Well, there's a lot of ways you could go with it. How do you narrow the field of requests that all these people like us are throwing at you?
I think, a lot of it comes down to just how do we think about what are the ways that we can be most of like what are we best positioned to do and solve? Like certain things. I think there are. We try stay out of the IDE and like kind of the developer in the loop, and we want to focus on those tasks where Dosu can do its work in the background. So that helps narrow the scope a bit. And then part of that I think is like also really again focusing on what LLMs we think they're good at, and a lot of it is like finding information, structuring information, and then making that information available. So yeah.
I also want to ask one personal roadmap item question, which is you've been helping out the Superset community a bit with these kind of repo activity summaries. I don't know where you're going with that as a feature, so I'm curious, but it's a huge help for those that want to stay on top of a code repo without having to stare daily at all the issues and PRs and everything happening. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, that's I think hopefully part of this like larger vision around building an engineering knowledge base for like Superset or any project really, where recent changes is just one piece of that. So you get a change log out of the box that maybe you can subscribe to or have formatted to what you care about. Like I often follow GitHub projects in GitHub because I care about like one specific feature that I either want to see released or I want to see fixed or updated, and so like being able to allow people to subscribe to like that specific thing that they care about for this project, I think would be really cool.
Yeah, I'll take the next question. So no, at Preset, I mean, in a lot of places, people really believe in the fact that open source is just a better way to write software, to collaborate on software, to deploy software, and then we think that there's a lot of reasons why open source is going to win and is taking over the world. But one new one is like maybe with this army of bots, including the Dosu bot and coding bots, that maybe open source projects are much better positioned to take advantage of this AI revolution and this new world of like agents and bots. Curious on your thought on that, as to whether you see the fact that a project is open source like being in a better position to really capitalize on that.
I think so. I'm very bullish on LLM's impact on open source or AI generally. For one, I think you're right 100% that like LLMs are going to be trained on and much more familiar with open source code than closed source code. And so I think they'll probably be able to better position to contribute to those. Also be better able to allow people to use those. Like I can imagine if you're trying to you have developers trying to integrate some closed source solution versus an open source solution, it's going to be much easier in the future to do it with a open source version because of LLM's exposure probably to that information prior. I also am very bullish on like coding, open source coding agents. I think we haven't been super focused on the PR generation process at Dosu because I think a lot of developers are excited about it, and I think like Open Devin is a good example of this type of open source effort for building kind of coding agents. I think there's going to be a lot of development and collaboration on that because it's just a really fun problem for developers that a lot of people want to work on. So I think like the open source kind of coding agents are going to get really, really good over the next few years.
Yeah, I'm wondering who's going to sponsor it. I mean, clearly, like for us, we sponsor the open source project. So, Preset sponsors Superset, and, Confluent sponsors Kafka, and there's some clear relationship there. But it could be that anyone could sponsor agents to work on any open source project too, right? So you get like some of our customers or some of the people from the community, or Airbnb saying like, I'm going to put like a $10,000 budget on this bot budget. Now the challenge is like we're gonna have to manage all these bots. Like who's gonna merge that code? Who's gonna review that code, merge that code? So then another more pessimistic view is I think Evan, you mentioned that when we spoke before, but I forgot how you called it. But it's like, are we gonna get this symphony? How did you call it? A symphony?
Oh yeah. Well, it was basically when all these bots start showing up on everybody's repo, and mini bots are chiming in on an issue. How do you make it more of a chorus of bots than a cacophony of bots? Like, will there be a way for them to kind of call each other out even and say, "Hey, bot A, you're hallucinating," anything like that?
Yeah, and how do the bot do code review, or does that create more of a burden on true maintainers? And like, certainly, like you're on the right side of the equation I think working around issues and documentation and all of this, but all these other bots that will be like, I'm going to fix I'm going to migrate all your JavaScript to TypeScript. There's 10,000 PRs for each one of your module. Like, whoa, what's happening here?
Yes, I think that's going to be one of the most important problems for us and for other kind of related companies, bots to solve around LLMs in the future is making sure that they're not creating more work than they're actually saving time. Because you can imagine like if things keep going well, like LLMs get really good, they're going to be able to outpace people. And like how do you do that in a way that you're not just overwhelming people even more? With work to do and review.
Like we're fine, like handing off the keys at some point if all those bots are much better than us to do all of it, So it could be like, hey, we're going to enable a merger bot that reviews code and applies the standards and merge the and at some point you realize that 10% of the conversation is bots. At some point it's 50%. At some point it's 90%, and they're all like autonomous and doing well, and the project is getting amazing. I'm like, all right, there you go. We're gonna. When is it? Maybe this question for Evan. When do you think is the first PMC approved estimator bot is going to be voted in? 2
Will
years?
we be able to tell?
Yeah.
Good question.
And will we be on a desert island somewhere, kind of sipping on Mai Tais, while that happens?
Well, it won't be long before they need write access, so we'll have a committer voted in before long. I don't know. Time will tell. But yeah, getting them all to pull in line is definitely an interesting topic as these things proliferate. I guess the other proliferation question is around kind of how do you maintain kind of a competitive advantage over the other competitors in your market? How do you find unique features, or what are yours? How do you deal with that issue in kind of an exploding market?
It's a hard question, but I think so. I mean, generally in like any early stage startup, like execution matters a ton. But I think we're being really conscious about like what we work on and what we don't work on. We have been since day one around, like I mentioned before, a lot of people focused on PR generation because it's a really fun, interesting problem. But we think we can deliver value by trying to solve other problems first around issue triage. So we've been focused there. And then I think also like, we're very fortunate to work with a lot of amazing maintainers and companies, and just listening to what, not just what they want, because like you're saying before, people have a lot of requests for Dosu. You can see basically you're like, can this solve any of my engineering problems? But trying to see the commonalities between what everyone's saying and what we think we can actually solve, and prioritizing those is really important. So yeah, picking kind of what we work on, I'd say pretty typical startup challenges.
Cool. And if you were to look ahead at the software engineering challenges that people live with day to day, what's kind of your prognostication of how the developer workflow might change over the next year or two, whatever seems like a reasonable horizon?
Good question. I think the way we build software, I think just developers are going to become more productive is kind of my take. I don't think we're all losing our jobs, but I think people will write more code. Hopefully, it'll be easier to like review code faster, and then also when issues come in or questions come in, they are resolved faster. So I think things will just start moving a lot faster. I think also there's probably a lot of things that were in the future we'll just take for granted that are like harder now. Like how do I get started with a project, or like this open source library? I think hopefully will become a really like automated process and like really easy for developers to do. So I think getting started with open source, contributing hopefully as well will be a lot easier. So I think that's how I see things moving. I don't think we're going to be doing, I think just a lot of the things, a lot of easy things will be automated, but we'll just be doing more faster, as with technology typically pushes us towards.
Yeah, one way to look at it is like, how do we spend our time today? Like maybe you bucketize that, put that in different buckets, and then you say which one of these buckets we're not going to spend time doing anymore because it's just like it will be automated or it will be like highly assisted. So maybe like digging around in the code repo to find the place where the button you're trying to change exists. Like, so searching through code base, like that should become pretty quick. Then there's the whole like architecture side of things. Like, how do you design, architect, or model even things like that? Maybe that's a place that we're still gonna need humans for a little while.
Exactly.
Like change management, to how you roll this out, kind of the executive skills of like how are we gonna phase out this change over time. Like maybe that's still human. But like one thing, I did some thinking. I think I wrote a blog post. I don't know if I published it yet, but it was around like how the skills of like data practitioners, so more geared towards data engineers and data analysts, analyst engineers, like how are those roles gonna evolve as the AI is unleashed upon us. And I think one thing that I think is pretty clear that maybe applies to software engineer too is like, I think we're going to go more breadth versus depth. So instead of having like becoming really specialized in a specific, say, JavaScript framework or specific set of libraries, or being really specialized in like DevOps and infrastructure, that we're going to see more people kind of have more breadth than depth, because the AI can help you become an expert into, or it can kind of fill in the whole of the specialty, right? So we can become more orchestrator than like musician or expert as a specific instrument or something like that.
I agree 100%. Yeah, I think like things like I'm biased, but I hope in the future we're spending more time coding. Like that's what we want to let developers do at Dosu, and less time, like you're saying, searching for which piece of code to modify or reacting to incoming issues, or kind of the project management, operational overhead of just engineering teams. And then I think we will definitely like also hopefully it's easier to move across the stack, because it's easier to get started with different projects. People become a lot more full stack, and can move hopefully even across teams more easily at companies and projects as well.
I guess this kind of begs the question a little bit of, for those who are earlier in their software career, what sorts of skills should they be focusing on developing, and what are kind of the timeless skills that you think are going to survive longer or be more valuable for a longer time?
I think learning the fundamentals is always important. Maybe I felt like one of the most, in my last role, I worked a lot with Kubernetes and almost in like a SRE type of fashion. And I learned a ton about like Unix level operating system stuff. And I actually felt that learning about Unix and how things fail and what is actually going on under the hood has helped me a ton, just debugging outside of it. And I think that's just going to be true moving forward, is like really understanding what's going on under the hood, especially when LLMs might be writing more of it, being able to react when things go, like when you're not on the happy path, because I think that's inevitable. Like things won't be perfect. There's going to be some margin of error. And so when things go wrong, that's where you end up spending a lot of time. And so I think the best way to prepare for minimizing that and like kind of always being able to be productive is just understanding what's going on under the hood. So if when there's ambiguity, like you have a place to think through things from first principles. That's my take. But
yeah, I think I agree. I mean, even using LLMs for any topic, if you're creating a recipe for dinner, you need to know the fundamentals of cooking enough to say that like this is not going to work as a recipe. You might not have to be a master of French cuisine anymore, but you need to know that this doesn't look right. And if you're writing a blog post, it turns you more from an author into a proofreader, where you have to still provide voice and just make sure that it makes sense to post this content. So it kind of turns the role around to be more of a critic of the code. And but you're right, you have to have understanding of how these things work more deeply, which is potentially tricky when starting out. And that's
that makes sense. I'd like to think of what's the advice to junior engineers as to how to structure their kind of learning plan. I would say go team up with AI to build broad big projects, right? So maybe you start from scratch, you build an entire app from end to finish with the help of AI, touching a little bit of the back end, the front end, the architecture, the Kubernetes, or Helm scripts to deploy this thing. So you get to learn how to team up with AI and orchestrate it and get exposure to the different level of the stack. That's one way to do it. Though I think that's like building a toy app is always a good thing to get exposed to everything. Though the reality is a lot of people join companies that have very large code base. Like when I joined Facebook, there's a massive mono repo, and the reality is like you're not building a small app from scratch. You're dealing with a crusty layered application with like 5 generations of engineers that have intricately work on different places then in different part of that app, and it's a big like ball of like chicken wire and duct tape and everything in between. So I think that part, the skill of like being able to contribute to large complicated code base with the help of AI, still like to augment it in a way, but I think that's still a very, very important skill for like orientation and like navigation and figuring out how to contribute a thing as part of something gigantic is still a very important skill.
100%.
Cool. Well, speaking of teaming up, not so much with AI, but with Dosu in particular, are there any sort of events you want to call out or websites people can learn more at, or how do people get connected with you and sign up?
Is it open source only too? Like, do you do private repo? So we've had the joys of doing that and working with Dosu in the open, but can people bring it to their private repos too?
Yeah. So to get started, I mean, one, I guess just go to dosu.dev, dosu.dev, and then get started. We have a wait list, but if you reach out, we'll take you off it. We're trying to get rid of the wait list very soon. Dosu works really well within open source, but we also work closed source and enterprises. So if you have kind of an internal code base that you would help with on the maintenance side, like Dosu can be a great fit. We integrate with GitHub, Slack, Linear, and Jira coming soon. We've also had a lot of traction within internal platform teams because it functions very much like open source. So, and if you have a question,
is the pricing model kind of free for open and pay for private, and then what does that look like on the private side?
Yeah, so on the open source side, it's free up to a certain request usage limit. And then we have exceptions for foundation related projects. And then on the closed source side, we charge per user per month. So how many people are interacting with Dosu at your organization?
Amazing.
Very cool. Well, having used it, I can highly recommend it to anyone listening. Go ahead and check it out on Superset, and reach out to Devin for more. Thank you very much for joining us today and answering all these questions. We really appreciate what you're doing for our project and appreciate you being here.
By the way, anyone can go and see and just look at our issues and PR on the Superset repo. So you can go to the Superset repo and just filter on, just search for the Dosu bot on there, and you'll see it in action every day, and like triaging, answering questions, and getting better over time too. So you can see the progression right from the older issues from like 6 months ago until now, how it's learning and getting better every day, which is amazing.
Yep. It's closed a lot of issues, and thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having me. This has been a ton of fun. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Max.
All right. Thank you. Take care.